Welcome to MeatsPad, a platform dedicated to sharing breakthrough knowledge that is accessible to the meats industry. On each episode, we will hear from meat specialists and professionals to talk about numerous topics in meat science, including animal welfare, meat production, meat quality, food safety, and so much more.
Hello, meat folks. Welcome back to the MeatsPad podcast. Very thrilled, excited about this episode. Have some of the former guests back on the MeatsPad podcast, Dr. Travis Arp and Dr. Dustin Mohrhauser. Welcome.
You guys must have done something right. You're back.
It's good to be back.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
And in person this time. Yeah.
So we had some questions on the Expo Market, and I know we talked and we visited about the Expo Market when you were on the podcast. When we had Dr. Mohrhauser, we talked about that communicating channel. So I think it's going to be like a combined approach to look at this one of. It's been an issue for quite a while. We're going to talk about pork fat, the importance of pork fat, and more specifically for those folks exporting bellies and exporting primals when it comes to the softness of the fat. So I don't know about you, Dr. Baz, but I'm excited to talk about this, some of the challenges that we see on the line, and who else. I mean, we got this awesome people to talk about that.
Yeah, well, and you know, let's start it off first. Let's be just a little bit scientific, if you would. And Dustin, maybe you can kick this off. But what are some of the things that affect pork fat firmness, and things that the listeners might be able to either better understand with the carcasses that they have, or provide feedback for their farming partners?
Yes, that's a very good place to start, I think. I think the biggest thing is you think about pork fat quality. All you're really concerned with is whether it's soft or firm. And being firm is better in terms of fat quality, obviously. And some things that can really influence it, if you think about the type of animal that a pig is, it's a monogastric animal. So basically whatever it eats in terms of its diet. So the diet is very important in terms of influencing fat quality. So whatever that pig is going to eat in terms of fatty acids, it's going to deposit those in the fat. And that's what's ultimately going to influence fat quality, whether or not it's soft or firm. Other things can also influence fat quality. Some of those include just maybe physiological maturity of that animal. So if a pig is pretty young and not really reaching maturity, the fat cell maturity becomes important on that. So if it's got an immature fat cell, it's filled more with, say, water instead of being filled up with triglycerides. So if an animal is easier keeping, if you want to term it that way, something that's earlier maturing, a little bit fatter, they typically have a little bit firmer fat than something that's a little later maturing type of lean type of pig. It's even some impacts with gender differences. If you think about gilts versus barrows, gilts are kind of a later maturing animal versus barrows. So gilts are typically a little thinner in terms of fat and also a little bit softer in terms of fat than the barrows would be as well. Other things that can influence fat quality, just from a production standpoint, can include just some health challenges or environmental challenges you may have. So it could be raised in some heat, really some hot times where a pig kind of goes off feed. That's kind of the biggest thing, is where the limited nutrients and don't really have the chance to deposit that fat that they normally would.
Yeah, no, and I think Dr. Arp, could you please elaborate more on those challenges and that maybe American producers encounter when they're trying to export pork, and they have this. So what are some of the measures that out there to measure the softness or the firmness of fat?
Well, I guess from the export perspective, the two kind of key components that we think of as it relates to fat quality is going to be the kind of consumer perception of that product, specifically for product that's going to go into retail, and how that product is going to look on the retail shelf and be perceived or preferred, if you will, by consumers. The second aspect of that is going to be shelf life. And given that there's going to be more transit time for that pork that's going to be going from the United States to over to an export market, whether that's frozen or chilled, there still needs to be, good quality, high quality pork from a fat perspective in order for that product to have some staying power on the shelf life, to be, well integrated into further processed products. And so that's kind of how we look at it specifically from an export standpoint. And we work with companies like Smithfield with Dustin and other pork producing companies to kind of get that feedback that we see in the international market on maybe what some of those issues are that our international customers are seeing, and we try and communicate that back down to the packer level so they can work on those solutions from the production side in order to make sure that we address issues that we might be seeing internationally.
I love the taste of pork fat. I think it's kind of hard to beat for a lot of reasons, especially when you get into further processed items. But especially on the fresh side, when you're just grilling or stewing or whatever you're doing with it, the flavor is incomparable. And I would imagine there's definitely some specific countries out there that appreciate it almost as much as I do. Where are we sending certain pork cuts, and are we shipping fat trimmings?
Yeah, so Asia is a massive market. I guess in general, you can break that down to, there's various markets within that. Japan is one of the largest export markets, and is one that is very preferential towards high quality pork, both from a lean color standpoint, but also they can be very picky about the fat quality on that product. But then you get to a market like China, and we're sending a lot of further processing items, bone-in and boneless picnics, trimmings, and that is really one of the primary markets that we send actual pork cutting fat to. Again, that goes into that further processing sector. Central America, or Mexico and Central America is one that's really growing on the further processing side, and it is again another market that we would just be sending trimmings and cutting fat into. But we really try and differentiate, as we talked about on the last time I was on the podcast. We try and differentiate that carcass, utilize it around the world as much as we can, and kind of create value on those specific cuts by putting those into markets that are going to have more demand for them.
What are some of the challenges? This goes like to you, Dr. Mohrhauser. Like on your day-to-day operations, what are some of the challenges you encounter when it comes to exporting? Do you have anything like objectively to evaluate the firmness of fat?
Yes, that's a good question. There's different ways you can evaluate firmness of fat, and I think kind of the easy one you could do is typically thinking about bellies, because that's a primal that's obviously a lot more percentage or higher proportion of fat than a lot of your other primals. So the easy thing to do is some either objective or subjective belly flap scores, kind of some firmness scores based off of those. So we do those very frequently within our own company. I'm sure other companies do the same thing as well. But if you want more objective measurements, there's a way to really look at fat quality, looking at iodine value. So iodine value is just basically and don't think about it, how much iodine's in there. Iodine value is actually just the amount. Oh, geez, I'm actually going nuts here. Okay. My description of it is just how many grams of iodine is absorbed by 100 milliliters of fat or an oil. So the higher the number means it's softer, more unsaturated. If it's lower, it's going to be firmer and just have more saturated fatty acids within that. So that's one thing that the industry can do. And I know there's a lot of us out there doing a lot of that on a day-to-day basis. Frequency-wise, it's maybe a little different, but that's one thing to do is capture fat samples, and you can run them on a gas chromatography, looking at fatty acid profiles to calculate an iodine value. Or there's other methods that are more rapid that'll give you iodine values as well.
What are some of the practices? I mean, we could talk about chilling, we could talk about genetics, we can talk about diet, but what are some of the things, like tangible things, that you guys do on a daily basis to tackle this problem?
I think a lot of it for us is just, collecting that data and providing that information back to suppliers is the big thing, and kind of working with them. On a database, other things in the plant day-to-day wise, you think about chilling can have an impact in terms of how that fat quality feels in the plant, but also kind of that storage temperature in the long run too kind of helps kind of mitigate any shelf life concerns you may have with some of those that may be a little higher in iodine value and more susceptible to oxidation that you're going to see.
And this is actually news to me. It's probably no surprise. I live in the beef world more, and so I've never heard of the iodine value, and that's kind of neat. Is that something that a small processor could do on their own, or is this kind of a little bit more of an elaborate laboratory assay?
It's probably a little bit more elaborate. You can collect samples though and send them off to a lab to do. That's pretty simple to do. I mean, cost-effective wise, maybe not so much, but I mean that's an option if you really want to get down to it objectively and really try to track something and figure out what's going on some of those.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys had a chance to listen to it, but hopefully some of our listeners have. I had the opportunity to interview a master German butcher for a bonus episode of ours, looking at further processing with pork and especially talking about pork fat quality and the different types of fats that are deposited throughout that carcass. Are you familiar much with that? Like the ham or the leg is going to have a different level of saturation to the back and the belly, etc.
Yes, actually, there is some good research out there looking at different fat depots and kind of how those differences in iodine value. And I mean, there is some differences. There's some differences out there. I mean, Dr. Apple actually from Arkansas, they actually had a paper looking at just belly fat depots. It was just across the belly, different regions, whether it was ventral to dorsal, cranial to cranial to just anterior to posterior type of thing is what they're looking at. And there's differences from end to end on both sides of those. So it's kind of unique to kind of look at that. So that's why it's important if you're actually measuring iodine value. I would say it's important to understand the depot you're collecting it from, keep it consistent, because somebody else may be looking at it from a different spot. Maybe it's a jowl versus back fat layer. Those are going to give you different results in terms of what that looks like. And part of that is just kind of the turnover of those fatty acids and how those change that quickly.
Well, and to remind our listeners out there, speaking of the different types of fatty acids, saturated versus unsaturated, saturated fats are going to have a lot more of that firmness. Monounsaturated will still be more firm than polyunsaturated. And it's just how much those molecules have bent and how they stack well together. And if we can get a little bit more of those saturated fats, which is not something to be scared of, by the way, even though in the past that has been almost a 4-letter word, those more saturated fats do give that more firmer texture to everything.
Yeah, and then I think I'd like to bring up the fact that different countries have a different Iodine value, right? I mean, you go to Europe, they might have a different pork quality audit or evaluation that they do. So how's that work? Especially you have processing a lot of bellies and loins, and how do you segregate that to see this type of quality goes to Europe, this type of quality goes to South America, this quality goes to Japan? How do you, maybe you can talk more about the price, because that's really determines that type of market.
Well, and if I can jump in too, there are standards out there, right, that we can use for those subjective and objective evaluations.
Yeah, I would say that, I had mentioned this before, but Japan is one of those countries that I would say is probably as picky on pork quality as any importer of U.S. pork globally. And in some situations, major customers of packers in the U.S. will have Japanese, I say quote unquote inspectors from their importers standing on those loin lines and saying, that's one we want for Japan. That's one you can keep for domestic, because they have this really strong preference towards a much darker lean color and kind of a brighter, firmer fat quality. So that's a classic example that we see in the export market of trying to kind of differentiate. And they pay extra for that. They will, that chilled pork we send to Japan is usually some of the highest value pork that we export anywhere in the world. But it's extremely important to them, and kind of back to your point, Francisco, on differences between countries. We've seen a lot in the last few years where the Canadian pork industry has gained a lot of market share in Japan, because a lot of the pork the hogs that they feed in Canada is fed like more of a wheat-based diet, and that affects that Dustin was talking about in terms of diet on fat quality.
That's what they like.
that Canadian pork is really bright white fat. It's a lot firmer than U.S. pork, and so from a retail standpoint, Japanese customers really have a preference towards the Canadian supply. On the opposite side of that, though, they really like U.S. pork for a further processing product because they like the flavor of the U.S. pork fat, and based on our grain and corn-fed, soybean-fed diets there, but they like the looks of the Canadian pork. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy in the market on kind of that preference on quality that the Japanese consumers and buyers really have there.
That's really fascinating. Well, and Dustin, would you happen to notice from region to region, because you have plants kind of scattered here,
All
there,
over
and
the
everywhere.
country, yep.
Yeah. Do you notice differences? And I'm assuming it's still minimal, but some differences in regional fat.
Yeah, I mean, you've definitely got some regional differences, and a lot of it is in terms of diet, just your diet availability, what feedstuffs you're including. I mean, some places corn may be really high priced, so you may be trying to get by with some byproducts of bakery industry, and some of those can be good, some of those can be bad for fat quality. So I mean, there are some of those things going on. To his point, if you get some feeding maybe out here in Colorado, that area, you might have a lot more wheat available that you might be able to include in the diet, so it might be a lot firmer. So I think there's definitely some regional differences that you can notice. And from our standpoint, when we go through looking at those, again, we try to monitor things frequently, provide feedback, and I mean, our nutritionists that we work with and our suppliers we work with are all pretty well aware of what we're sending back for data. So if there are any things, regardless of what you're feeding, as long as you're able to kind of keep things in check for us, that's all we ask for them.
Well, and the right thing to do is still to use the resources that are available to you. And so, I mean, that's the industry as a whole, is we're very, very efficient, very effective in those manners. And even though there may be subtle differences in texture of fat or even color, the quality is still going to be good. The safety, of course, is top of mind and everything. And so nothing to detract the purchasers of pork out there. Something I do want to bring up. We've been talking predominantly about subcutaneous fat. I assume that's what's been on most everyone's mind, subcutaneous and some seam fats. Tell us a little bit about what the industry is doing as far as marbling in pork right now. Are we making advancements? Are we using some of the standards that are available to us?
I would think we've made some advancements. I think actually Travis and I were talking a little bit earlier about things and just kind of where the industry's gone, kind of removing some of the beta agonists out there. I think we've moved to more durox-sired pigs out there. So I think just in doing so with some of those, we've removed some of those maybe poor quality type pigs on the bottom end of the spectrum. And I think we've making advancements here, at least in the last 5-10 years, pretty significantly just by doing some of those things.
Yeah, and I think that the demand for pork, not only internationally but domestically, I think has kind of reflected kind of some of those overall industry advances from a quality standpoint. And as consumers, you eat a good pork chop and you want to come back to that.
Yep,
and as we see quality kind of get raised across the board in the industry because of some of those things that Dustin talked about, I think that's being reflected in the numbers there. At the same time, we're also seeing on the export side growth in some different kind of niche marketing for extremely high quality pork. Companies that get into more of the heritage breed type genetic base, Berkshire programs, things like that. I mean, that's never going to be the majority or even, a huge percentage of the pork that we produce in the U.S., but we are seeing demand for some of those niche programs in our higher value markets like Korea, like Japan, and even a little bit into China and elsewhere. So, I think there's still opportunities to, differentiate yourself and kind of market on a higher value plane than commodity pork. Not only, like I said, domestically, but we're seeing growth for that internationally.
Visited with one of my good friends in Mexico. He works for Elanco, Dr. Diego Braña. I don't know if you guys ever talked to him, but we talk about pork fat, but we kept going back to the swine nutritionist, the role of the swine nutritionist, that for us meat scientists, it's, whatever product you have, the carcass you have is like, if it doesn't go, if you're not receiving good quality, as far as we talk about fat, it's impossible to give us that responsibility. Hey, I want good quality, but it all starts from the very beginning. I mean, the production side of things. So I don't know what you guys think of that.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would take it one step further. I think it actually starts with genetics to begin with. I mean, it starts with that solid foundation. Then from what you do from there, I mean, kind of dictates that potential that the genetics had to begin with. And I think it's a whole pork chain system issue. I mean, that's something we got to go through. And I think pork quality, not only just thinking about fat quality, I think just pork quality in general. You always get those questions of, well, what's the silver bullet? What's the one thing you have to do? It's like, well, it's a matter of doing everything right along the way. If you do one thing wrong, then you have issues. But if you continue to do everything right along the way, hopefully you've started out and strong genetically, and then did high quality nutrition and kind of had good management practices all the way through, and hopefully results in high quality pork for you.
Well, one kind of point, or I guess quote, that's always resonated with me is Dr. Brad Johnson at Texas Tech, who's one of the foremost muscle biologists in the world. A comment that he's made several times is that the highest genetic potential that an animal has for marbling as well as quality is the day that animal is born, and that everything we do from a production standpoint going forward is only going to limit that potential. And I think from the pork industry standpoint, there's been so many advances in trying to eliminate those kind of external forces that could potentially have a negative effect on quality, to the point where I think, modern swine production does a tremendous job of trying to maximize the quality that we can get out of those animals. And I'm sure there's opportunities to move that forward. But to me, I think the swine industry is a really good example of taking advantage of that and trying to improve the entire supply chain to maximize quality.
There's always improvements being made, especially in the swine community, and great leaps in changes and improvements. It's a relatively short generation interval. We can make those decisions relatively quickly, and I'd say that the pork industry is really clicking right along as far as optimizing. I would say maximizing the opportunities of growth and quality at the same time.
Yeah, multifactorial, I think. You got to have genetics, animal welfare, chilling. It's like diet, everything else that everyone plays a role to have an ultimate good quality product. So,
right, and it works hand in hand. I mean, the packer as well as the producer got to work pretty closely. It's a responsibility of both of them to produce a high quality product.
Perfect. Well, and we constantly talk about this on the podcast, is that line of communication, and the pork industry is a great example of getting that information back to the producers so that we can continue to produce what the customer needs, what the packer would desire to process, and what the export market desires. So, yeah.
Well, thank you guys for joining us. Do you have any last thoughts on this topic?
I'll let you go first if you have something, Travis.
Well, like I said before, I think that the quality situation, just in my time at USMEF, being involved in the international markets, is something that I've seen progress in the last decade. And we're exporting the last several years record numbers of pork. I think that the improvements that have been made in quality along the supply chain are reflective of the demand that we see overseas. And I think there's just been a tremendous amount of headway made on trying to figure out the pork quality equation and doing something that we can bring these repeat customers back. And like we mentioned a second ago, I think it'll continue to improve as we go along.
And I think that's, as you keep bringing up kind of the feedback back and forth with producers and packers, and I think pork industry, does a great job from where I'm sitting, trying to provide that feedback, trying to produce and make those advances that we can do to try to keep improving not only efficiency, but also meat quality and everything to kind of keep advancing our product out there for the, the betterment for eating consumption and the eating satisfaction of our consumers. So,
all great news.
Yeah. Well, thank you a lot for joining us today. And, I'm sure we'll keep the conversation rolling around a different topic down the road. Thank you, guys.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
you.